Most people who have survived a narcissist want one thing: to understand what they just walked through. They want a map of the territory. Carl Jung gives you that map. But here is what most people do not know about Jung and narcissism. He did not simply study it from a safe clinical distance. He was drawn to it, repeatedly, personally, at great cost to himself. The man who gave us some of the most penetrating psychological insights in human history spent significant portions of his life in close orbit around narcissistic personalities, and rather than simply escaping and moving on, he went inward. He asked why. He excavated his own attraction to these souls until he understood something that most people never reach. Narcissism is not simply a personality disorder to be avoided. It is one of the most illuminating mirrors the human psyche can hold up to itself. To understand Jung's obsession, you have to start at the beginning, with Sigmund Freud. When Jung first encountered Freud, he was a young psychiatrist already doing remarkable work, already thinking in ways that went beyond what the field had mapped. Freud recognized his brilliance immediately and drew him close. He called Jung his crown prince, his chosen successor, the man who would carry psychoanalysis into the future. What Jung did not fully see at first was the architecture of control underneath Freud's generosity. Freud needed Jung's agreement. He needed disciples, not colleagues. When Jung began developing ideas that diverged from Freudian theory, ideas about the collective unconscious, about the spiritual dimensions of the psyche, about mythology and symbol and the deeper layers of human experience, Freud did not engage with curiosity. He responded with something that Jung would later recognize as narcissistic injury: the cold withdrawal, the pathologizing of disagreement, the subtle but unmistakable message that loyalty to Freud the person was inseparable from loyalty to Freud's ideas. Their eventual break was one of the most consequential ruptures in the history of psychology, and it sent Jung into what he later described as a period of profound disorientation, a confrontation with his own unconscious so intense that he wondered at times whether he was losing his mind. But something extraordinary came out of that darkness. Jung emerged with the understanding of narcissism that went far deeper than anything clinical observation alone could have produced. He had felt it from the inside. He had experienced the gravitational pull of a powerful, brilliant, charismatic personality that organized the world entirely around its own center. And he had felt what it cost him to finally break free. This personal experience shaped everything that followed. Jung came to understand narcissism not as a simple excess of self-love, but as a profound deficit of self. What appears on the surface as grandiosity, as the unshakable belief in one's own centrality and importance, is in Jungian terms a compensation, a psychic structure built to protect an interior that never developed the capacity to tolerate its own vulnerability. Jung identified the process he called individuation as the central task of psychological development, the long journey toward integrating all parts of the self, including the shadow, including the parts we find most shameful or frightening, into a coherent and genuine wholeness. The narcissistic personality, in Jung's framework, is one in which this process has been arrested, frozen at the point where the ego should have begun to surrender its absolute centrality and make room for the deeper self to emerge. The narcissist builds instead, constructs an elaborate external identity, what Jung called the persona, and then makes the catastrophic error of identifying with it completely. They become the mask, and because the mask requires constant external validation to maintain its structural integrity, they become dependent on the people around them in a way that is invisible beneath their apparent self-sufficiency. This is what Jung found so compelling. Beneath the grandiosity was a terror he recognized as universal, the terror of the unexamined self, the fear of going inward and finding something unbearable. The narcissist simply responded to that terror more dramatically than most, building their defenses higher, making their compensations more elaborate, requiring more from the people around them to sustain the illusion. Jung did not excuse this. He was clear that the damage narcissistic personalities cause to the people who love them is real and serious. But he refused to stop at condemnation, because condemnation without understanding produces nothing useful. He asked the deeper question: what does the narcissist show us about ourselves? And here is where Jung's obsession becomes genuinely revelatory. Jung believed that we are never simply passive victims of the narcissistic personalities we encounter, not because their behavior is our fault, but because the psyche does not create encounters randomly. The people we are most powerfully drawn to, including the ones who ultimately harm us, are carrying something we need to see. For many people, the narcissist activates what Jung called the savior complex within their own shadow. The unconscious belief that if they can love someone difficult enough, broken enough, defended enough, back into wholeness, they will have proven something essential about their own worth. The empath and the narcissist do not simply find each other by accident. They find each other because they are carrying complementary wounds that recognize each other across a crowded room. The narcissist's wound is a self that never learned to exist without a mirror. The empath's wound is a self that never learned it deserved to be mirrored in return. Together they create a dynamic that feels like intimacy, but functions like a closed circuit, each person's psychology locking the others in place. Jung's obsession with narcissism was ultimately an obsession with this lock, with understanding the mechanism precisely enough to find the key. He found it in the shadow work he prescribed for both parties. For the person who has been in relationship with a narcissist, the work is not simply to grieve what was taken. It is to ask honestly what the attraction revealed about their own unmet interior needs. What did they believe about their own worth that made invisible labor feel like love? What part of their own shadow was being projected onto someone who seemed powerful, someone who seemed to have solved the problem of self-doubt by simply refusing to entertain it? These are not comfortable questions, but Jung never promised comfort. He promised something more valuable: genuine self-knowledge, the kind that does not just help you survive the next encounter with a narcissistic personality, but changes the frequency you broadcast so fundamentally that the dynamic loses its power over you entirely. Jung loved narcissists in the way a great physician loves a particularly revealing illness, not with sentimentality, not with the kind of love that excuses or enables, but with the fierce, clear-eyed attention of someone who understands that what appears most destructive on the surface is often pointing most directly at what most needs to be healed. The narcissist in your life was not there to destroy you. They were there to show you exactly where your own interior work was waiting. Whether you do that work is the only question that has ever mattered.